Evening. So we're going to be discussing this evening the Seasons 2, episode number 5. And of course, before I get into it, I just want to take a moment and just remind you of what the premise is behind the chosen. The chosen obviously comes from the Greek word eklokas, and it's the word that means to choose one person. And so the premise behind the chosen is the choosing of the 12 apostles. And so far, and obviously, as we've gone through the choosing of the 12 apostles, the Bible doesn't necessarily explain exactly how that choosing takes place. Nevertheless, they were chosen. So we've seen Matthew, and we have seen Peter and Andrew, James and John. We saw James, who is called the last, as I mentioned already, Matthew. We saw the calling of Thomas and Nathaniel. Tonight we're going to see another apostle added to that list of individuals. But I just wanted to kind of make that clear to you that that's easy to get caught up in a lot of the minutia of what's going on in the series itself and forget the premises is that of being chosen. But the chosen of the apostle drifts down to us today, almost 2,000 years later, where we now, as Christians, are the chosen of God. We have been chosen by Jesus Christ. And of course, Ephesians, the first chapter, beginning in verse 3, talks about our being chosen and that we have been adopted as the children of God and have been redeemed and brought into the family of God. This evening, this episode is called Not What You Expected, and it probably gets the title from near the end of the episode itself, where Jesus calls Simon and he goes through an exercise of talking to him about a number of different things. The episode itself begins though with Mary, and Mary is walking along. She's picking persimmons from a tree, and as she's walking about and picking persimmons, she is kind of quoting through some passages of scripture that she's trying to put to memory, and she's been sharing those with Rama, and she's been fed some of those by Matthew. Well, she's picking the persimmons, and all of a sudden she becomes extremely terrified. She becomes very afraid. Do you remember why she became so afraid? Yeah, the Roman soldiers, they show up on the scene, and when she sees the Roman soldiers, she just goes into a panic. I thought to myself, why in the world would they begin the episode with Mary seeming to be going through life pretty happy, picking the persimmons, and all of a sudden she has this terrifying experience in the Romans? And the answer to that is that the scene is designed to set up the choosing of Simon, who is a zealot. That's what it's about. It's about how the Romans were extremely oppressive. It's hard for us, I think, in America to feel what it feels like to be under the oppression of a tyrant or under the oppression of an invading army that that lives in the land, and they call the shots. They make the rules, and they can almost get away with anything they want. I kind of mentioned some of them this morning, that a soldier could walk up to an individual and say to them, I want you to carry my pack for a mile. And Jesus says, if someone asks you to do that, go with him a second mile. The Romans could do it by law. They could walk up to an individual and say, you have to carry my pack and all the things that are there for a mile. They had that kind of a power. They could do a lot of things, other things to the citizens that they did not have to answer for. And so it could be that Mary sees these Roman soldiers and she's thrown into a panic. Well, when you talk about Simon, who was a zealot, it makes some sense because Simon is a member of an element of Judaism that were called zealots, and they had a single mission. Do you remember what the mission, or have you studied or thought about what the mission of the zealots were about? This is where you get to talk. Okay, go ahead. Yeah, so that was their deal, is they wanted to overthrow the Roman Empire, or the Romans that were in their land. They wanted to push them out, and they were going to push them out by force. So we're not talking about a bunch of come-lately kind of individuals. We're not talking about individuals that didn't think this through. We're not talking about individuals who did not train and did not spend some time getting ready to do this very thing. And so that is Simon, and he is a part of those people. Then the next episode goes into the healing of the lame man that is being questioned. So open your Bibles, if you would, to John, the 5th chapter. We're going to be looking at verses 5 through 17. Now, you recall that, that Jesus had healed the lame man at the pool of Bethesda. And so it says that it's by the sheep gate. So he walks up through the sheep gate, which is on the west wall. I think it's called Lion's Gate today, but up through the sheep gate. He walks about maybe 100 yards, maybe a little bit further than that. And he hangs a right and he walks over to the pool of Bethesda. And at the pool of Bethesda, it says that the lame, that the blind, and the paralyzed used to lay there and looking for a healing, of trying to get into the water when someone or some angel stirs the water up. Well, Jesus, he walks up to the man and he tells him to pick up his pallet and to walk, and the man does so. Well, look at verse 5. And the man was there who had been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been a long time in that condition, he said to him, "Do you wish to get well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, but while I am coming, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your pallet, and walk." Immediately the man became well, picked up his pallet, and began to walk. Now this was on the Sabbath day. So the Jews were saying to the man who was cured, "It's the Sabbath, and it is not permissible for you to carry your pallet." Does anything strike you about this at all? This guy, I mean, these people that are at the pool of Bethesda, they're ill. They're paralyzed, they're lame, they're blind. And now here this guy all of a sudden becomes well. He's been there 38 years, so it's not as though it's not well known that he's a lame man. And now he's able to walk. Does anything about this strike you as being insensitive? I mean, by the way, are we streaming this? We are. Okay, I didn't know we were streaming this. Okay, I have to be more cautious now. Okay, so anyway, so he does it on the Sabbath, and he says they're not rejoicing with him that he's able to walk. They're worried about the fact that he picked up his pallet. But he answered them, "He who made me well was the one who said, 'Pick up your pallet and walk.'" They asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Pick up your pallet and walk'?" But the man who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had slipped away while there was a crowd in that place. Afterwards, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "Behold, you have become well. Do not sin anymore so that nothing worse happens to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. For this reason, the Jews were persecuting Jesus because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But he answered them, "My Father is working until now. I myself am working. For this reason, therefore, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him." Why? Because he was breaking the Sabbath. So when you think about this city, what was it that the lame man was happy about? He can walk. I mean, that is incredible. 38 years lame, and all of a sudden you're able to stand up and you're able to walk. What were the Jewish leaders worried about? They're worried about rules. They're worried about him picking up his pallet and walking. And so the lame man learned something from this. And what he learned from it is that not everyone's going to be happy when something great happens to you or when God blesses you in an incredible way. So what law did the lame man break on the Sabbath? What was the law that he broke? Carrying his pallet. So it wasn't because he walked. By the way, which takes more energy, to walk or to pick up a pallet? Which takes more energy, to walk or to push an elevator button? When we were in Israel, we were there on several Sabbaths, and on the Sabbath there is a Shabbat elevator that says, you get on this elevator, and if you're 10 stories, you're going to stop at every door, at every level. At every floor, you're going to stop. And it says on there, do not push the button. Do not touch the button. So if you don't want to get stuck on a Shabbat, make sure you get on the other elevator where we'll go from 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 or whatever you're on, because to push the button was work. Picking up your pallet was work, but it wasn't against the law to walk. And even today, you can see Orthodox Jews, which are probably the most strict of the Jewish people there in Israel. You'll see them walking on the Sabbath, but it's not considered to be work. but picking up his mat was considered to be work. So let me ask you, do you suppose the lame man, he wanted to shout from the mountaintops of the fact that he had been healed? We got one right over here, Dana.
I think it's really telling of where you find him when Jesus finds him later. He's at the temple. Mm-hmm. He's not able to go to the temple before that because he's crippled and he's not allowed in.
Good.
So this is life-changing for him. This is all the things that he's rejoicing about, and all these guys can think of is our tradition, you broke it, and so they're going to come down on him for that.
Yeah, absolutely. What's interesting, did you notice some of the scenes where it shows the man as he's walking down the steps? It shows him kind of like, he's not just walking down a step. That's what we do. He walks down the step, and he is just thrilled about the fact that he can walk and step down, and he's got the strength in his legs to do that. I think that was incredible. And this Atticus shows up on the scene. He's supposed to be the kind of like the Roman spy of some kind of guy. I'm not sure what he is just yet. But he goes up and he talks to him about the fact that he's got this newfound health. He's trying to get some stuff out of him concerning Simon, but that's a lot of speculation there. But the point is that he comes down. He says, "You know what I think this is? I think it is a miracle." Remember what he says to him? "I know it is. I know it is. I know I was lame for 38 years, and here I am walking, and it's because this man Jesus told me to pick up my pallet and walk, and now I've got all my health." And that had to be extremely exciting to him. And so I really do think that probably that there was something in him that wanted to shout out loud, but he didn't. So what caused him not to? Well, what caused him not to was probably fear. Fear of what someone might say. I mean, the religious people, he has been healed, and what do? They didn't come up to him and rejoice in the fact that he is now walking. They come up to him that you have broken a law, that you've broken the Sabbath by picking up your pallet. By the way, there's nowhere in Scripture that says that. Or a lot of the things that they have put there, that came out because of the Mishnah. When we were in Israel, we went to a place that is a large garden. It's a national place, but it's a large garden. And in it are tombs. And it's tombs to Hani, which was one of the fathers of writing the Mishnah, which is the oral argument or the oral tradition being written down about here's how you apply the law. Here's what you do with the law, and that application became stronger almost than the Torah, or the Torah itself. And so you can kind of see how they could just add to it. And so when Jesus says, "You guys stack all kinds of loads upon people," over in Matthew the 23rd chapter, you get an idea of what he was saying there. And so Jesus didn't break a Sabbath by telling this man to pick up his pallet and walk. All he said is for him to do it, and so they're exercised at him because he did a good thing. So here's the question, if we were to make an application: have you ever been healed of anything such as, say, sin, being paralyzed by sin, and then when you were set free, what did you want to do about it? Did you want to shout it from the rooftop? Did you want people to know about that? And if not, why didn't you? Okay, so when I became a Christian, I was 18 years old, an athlete, had the cutest girlfriend in the school, that kind of stuff. Well, I thought she was anyway. Well liked by all the guys that I played football with and baseball with, and for the most part, a lot of different people. And then I quit going to the parties, and I quit drinking, and I quit fighting, and I started going to church on Sunday morning and Sunday evening, and then I got really fanatic and started going on Wednesday evenings, and then I became a Christian. And I wanted to tell everyone about that, but I didn't. I mean, I lived it, and they all knew that a big change would happen because they'd call up and say, "Hey, you want to go out tonight, it'd be like a Saturday night, you want to go out tonight and raise Cain, cause some trouble, and you want to go do that?" And I'd say, "No, I'm not doing that." "How come?" "Well, I got to get up in the morning." "Why do you got to get up in the morning?" "I go to church on Sunday morning." "Richard, you're becoming such a Bible thumper. You're becoming such a Jesus freak. and all those kinds of things. And so sometimes, something great happens to us and we were remiss in saying anything about it because we're afraid of maybe the blowback. And so I think that we can probably relate somewhat to this lame man, and what has gone on him. Anyone else have something that they'd like to share on this line? Right over here to Don. We need to get like a little drone thing. We could fly over, go by people, hang above their head.
I have wondered, Richard, why the Jewish leaders were even there at the pool, especially on a Sabbath. Depending on how far they had to walk, they've already broken their own tradition.
Yeah, possibly, yeah. Something to think about. I don't know why they were there. Right over here to Darla.
Maybe you're going to get to this yet, so I may be jumping the gun, but I just wondered if you're going to talk about what Jesus said to him about stop sinning or something worse may happen to you.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I think if I were to give an answer to that, I would simply say that I don't think he was a layman because of his sin, but there are consequences for sin that go beyond physicality, that go beyond the physical, and sin that hurts us spiritually speaking, and has even some more severe consequences spiritually speaking. That's just off the cuff. Anyone have something that they'd like to, some wisdom that they might like to share about that? Okay, so then we enter in with Simon the Zealot, okay? And so it begins by showing this guy here. And Simon, it begins, well, actually we were introduced in the episode 4, but this one here, you start to get more meat put on the bones, and it shows Simon, he's on his knees, and he's doing breathing exercises. He's got this discipline about him, so he's doing these breathing exercises, in with the air and out with the air, and those kinds of things. And then it shows him, as Adam mentioned last week, he's doing some ninja things. I don't know if they called it that back then, but he's doing some kind of a military combat type moves, and it shows him thrusting and doing different things with his dagger. It shows him using those kinds of things. And so what I think we know about the Zealots, and I'm going to continue on with this, is this, that they were a very disciplined and well-trained force that resisted the Roman occupation of Israel. Like I said earlier, these guys are not some guys who say, hey, I think I'll be a zealot. They were a part of what Josephus called the fourth element of Judaism. And that means that these guys were something pretty incredible. Flavius Josephus, who was a general in the Jewish army, who was captured, later becomes I wouldn't say he's a traitor, but he certainly begins to serve the Romans, okay? And he becomes a scribe and a historian, and so he writes down the history of the various things that happened throughout Jewish antiquity. And he writes that in his book called Josephus. And Josephus, speaking of the Zealots, said that they were considered the fourth element of Judaism. The four elements were this. There were the Pharisees. There were the Sadducees. The Pharisees believed in the resurrection and beyond the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The Sadducees were just the first 5 books of the Old Testament, did not believe in the resurrection. From the Sadducees came the wealthy of Judaism. From the Sadducees came the high priests of Judaism. That's where they came from. And certainly in Jesus' day, the Essenes were very monastic. They were isolationists. They believed that to stay connected with the general population of Judaism was to be tainted or to be influenced by them. So they oftentimes would draw themselves away from the people. And so maybe you've heard of Qumran. Qumran is where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they were a monastic group that many think were probably part of the Essenes. So that was an element of Judaism. And then you had the Zealots. You had these guys were super religious individuals, and they did not trust the Sanhedrin. They didn't trust the high priest. They didn't trust the priests themselves. They thought that they were all on the take and that they had rolled over to the Roman Empire in order to get ahead. Herod the Great is a great example of that. Herod the Great took lots of money in from the Romans. He did a lot of the bidding of the Romans, and that's why the Jewish people hated Herod. They hated Herod. He was Hasmonean and Jewish. He was a mixed breed, but he had a tremendous amount of power. And so there are those who hated them, and the zealots were those. The zealots were not just going to talk about getting rid of them. They trained and prepared in order to get rid of them. And so their mission was to expel the oppression of the Romans by force from Israel, whatever it took. An example of that would be, say, Masada. Years later, after Jesus' death, probably about 30 years later, the first Jewish war began in 64 AD, and it ended in 70 AD with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple itself. The Romans came in, Titus Vespasian. They surrounded the city with their legions. They eventually were able to break the walls down, and when they did, they completely leveled the temple. I saw some of that leveling when I was there just a couple of weeks ago. But they pushed out these giant stones. We're not talking about stones like this. We're talking about stones that are anywhere from 15 to 50 feet in length, 12 foot in width, and about that high, and pushed them down off the wall. These guys, by the time they got in the walls, they were angry Romans, and the blood was letting, and Josephus said that the streets ran deep in blood. Some of the zealots escaped out of Jerusalem, and they went to Masada. Masada was a high fortress up on top of a cliff. Here's an example of what it looked like. This thing was incredible. Over 1,000 of the zealots said, we're not going to stay under the rule of the Roman, and so they ran to Masada. Masada was a fortress that was on a very high plateau. I mean, it's up over like 1,800 feet, or more than that probably, up on a high plateau. And Herod the Great had built a fortress up there. Some say he built the fortress up there because he knew that the Jewish people hated him. So if things got bad, he's going to go to Masada. And up on top of Masada, it was a fortress, a double-walled city, but not just that. He has a palace that is built up there, and cisterns all the way around it. So he had water year-round in these cisterns. And when I say cistern, it's not like a cistern that when I was a boy in Oklahoma. This cisterns were like, probably 60 feet, 100 feet in diameter, and maybe that deep or deeper. And they had, troughs that ran around the edges of Masada and would drop down into these cisterns, and they'd fill up the cisterns, and those cisterns are all around that thing. And so it was an impregnable thing. These 1,000 zealots, they, along with their families, they went up to Masada, and they fortified it even more so. And the Romans, having cornered them, laid siege to it. Listen, the zealots were so good at what they did, they held the Roman army off for 4 years, a little over, just shy of 4 years. They held them off. I don't know if you can see this or not, but here's a ramp. See this ramp going up? That ramp was not there. This used to be like this. And the Romans, they built a ramp up to the walls of Masada. They used Jewish people to do it, and they built this ramp up there. And at the end, what they did is they finally put a battering ram up there, and they eventually broke through the walls. And when they got inside the walls, guess what they found? They found 996 people who had taken their lives. They had determined that they would not be slaves of the Romans, and that they would live as free men, and they would die as free men and women. And so if the Romans are going to win this thing, they're going to get an empty victory when they get through the walls. If I had time, I could share with you how they chose lots and how they decided to do this. But I'm saying this to you to understand what the mindset of a zealot was. And that's who Simon was. Simon was a zealot. Now, Adam said last night, we don't know anything about Simon. We only know that he's in the list of the apostles. Well, he's a pillar of the church, so that's big stuff in and of itself. But when you understand the mindset behind guys like Simon and those men that were going up against the Roman Empire, these are incredible people. They were the extreme radical right of Judaism. They felt the Jewish leadership from the center to the king had sold out to the Romans to do their bidding, and the zealots wanted no part of it. They wanted no part of it. This was the movement that Simon was a part of. Then we go to the next scene. They move off of Simon and they go to the next scene, and the next scene is between Matthew and Thomas, and there's some tension that's going on between them. Now, we don't know whether that happened or not, but it says something about how sometimes we can get in tension with one another. Let me ask you, you don't have to raise your hand here, but has there ever been anyone in the church that you just did not like? Okay, so I know I've been disliked by lots of people, but think about people that have not liked you, and maybe people that you don't like, okay? So here you have Matthew and Thomas. This is not the best picture, but they're outside, and Matthew and Thomas, they're sitting at a table, a preparation table, and they are dicing or slicing vegetables. At least that's what Thomas is doing. He's slicing vegetables, and Matthew is sitting there, and Matthew is talking to him, and Thomas obviously is exercised at him. And he's exercised at him because he's stuck with Matthew, okay? The other guys are out chopping wood or gathering wood or whatever, and he's left with Matthew, and he's not crazy about Matthew. And remember, Matthew asked him the question. He goes, "Do you not like me because I'm a tax gatherer?" And Thomas goes, "Oh, you're a tax gatherer." He goes, "You knew that." And then finally Thomas just says, "Yeah, that's why I don't like you. I don't like you because you are a tax gatherer." And then he adds some more information to it, and that maybe Matthew has something for Rhema, that he kind of likes Rhema maybe, because he's passing her, some Bible notes, and for her to memorize and to think about. And so he's got an issue with that. So these two are into it with one another. And so I got to think to myself, okay, how should Christians who don't like each other react to each other? How should we treat one another if we don't like someone? Because Matthew and Thomas are different people. And Thomas doesn't seem to like Matthew. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But I do know that within Christian ranks that we can get like that with one another, where there's people that we don't like. And so if there's someone that we don't like, how are we to treat them? This is your chance to tell me. Okay, over here is Don. You should have wore tennis shoes instead of those things you have on. You could have gone faster.
Bill Free used to say, if a husband and wife can't get along, remember, Jesus said, love your enemies.
Okay. Love it in your enemies. I could tell you some stories about Bill Free, but I won't. Okay. Anything else? Anyone else want to share? How are we to treat those that maybe we don't like? Okay. No one says that you go and talk with them. I mean, just what if there's someone in this room here, okay, tonight, where you say, I just don't like him. I don't like Dan Alligood. So how am I to treat Dan Alligood if I don't like Dan? Or maybe I'll choose Doug. I don't like Doug. So how am I to treat Doug? Am I to ignore him? Am I to have nothing to do with him? Has the fact that I don't like him changed the fact that he's a child of God and that I'm going to spend eternity with him one day in heaven and God might put my room right next door to him? And so how am I supposed to treat people that maybe I don't get along with, or maybe I'm just kind of they're an extrovert and I'm an introvert, or they're a wallflower and I'm the life of the party, and how do I treat those? How am I supposed to treat people that I'm not like? Okay, the way you would treat anyone else, you treat them with love, you treat them with respect, you're always courteous to them, you always treat them right. Okay, Dan said no one expected Judas until after. Yeah, and he said that's how well Jesus treated him. These men are going to desert Jesus within hours on that night, and he washes all their feet. I think Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 32, that we are to treat one another kindly and tender-heartedly, just as God in Christ has treated us, and that we're to be forgiving, just as we have been forgiven. I think what maybe the lesson is that we always try to take the high road, and always treat people with respect and courtesy. And if nothing else, to love them. to love them just as we have been loved. We're not always lovable people, you know. We don't always fly right. In fact, have you ever questioned in your mind why God wants anything to do with you? Why does God want me to be a child? Why does God want to spend eternity with me? I don't sometimes want to spend eternity with me, and yet God does. And that's how we ought to, I think, treat one another. Jesus then gets into a conversation between a couple of the episodes. Jesus gets into a conversation with John. We don't know that this happened or not, but they get into, I think, some interesting things. The two talk about the difficulty of carrying out the mission. John has a mission. His mission is to prepare the way. Jesus knows that's what his mission is. Do you remember John saying to Jesus in one part in this scene, he says, you know, when it gets down to it, this is really hard. I mean, and he asked him, does it ever feel real hard? Does it ever feel heavy carrying out the mission to do what we're supposed to do? It's not easy. And I think I can really see that. I can really feel what he was saying, that it's not easy to carry out the mission. And of course, as John goes away, after telling him that I'm going to confront Herod. That's Herod Antipas, by the way. That's the son of Herod the Great. I'm going to confront him about his illicit marriage and relationship that he has with Herodias. I'm going to confront him about that. And Jesus in the episode kinds of tried to dissuade him, because he knows if you do so, that guys like Herod got a lot of power, and some of the power that they have is they can take your head off. But John is determined that he is going to carry out that mission. That's, by the way, found over in Mark chapter 16, and in that section, in the section there. It's the story about Herod being confronted by John and him imprisoning John, and then about the party that they had that leads up to John's head being asked for. And it says Herod doesn't want to do it, but he has already made a promise, and so he carries it out, and so he has John beheaded. Over in John the 6th chapter, by the way, in John the 6th chapter, it says that Jesus, or in the 5th chapter into the 6th chapter, it says that Jesus hears the news about John being beheaded, dying, and it says, and he goes away to a lonely place to isolate himself. What do you think he was going away to isolate himself for? He's going to grieve. He's going to mourn for his cousin. He loves John. He says, no one is of greater faith than John. That's incredible when you said that about someone. No one's of greater faith than John. No one's been like John. You know, some said John was like Elijah or Jeremiah. John was John, and when he was beheaded, it says that Jesus went away to an isolated place, I believe, to mourn and to grieve the loss. He gets there in John the 6th chapter, and a crowd hears that he's there, and they all gather around him. He doesn't even have time to grieve. He has to start teaching the people, over 5,000, and that's where he feeds the 5,000 with the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. So John is determined that he is going to take a stand. The question I thought, and there might be others, okay, but the question I thought was, do you believe it is a Christian's responsibility to call out sin in the world when we see it? And John was bold. You know, John says, that's filthy what he's doing, and he's not going to get away with that. I don't care who he is. And so he confronts him. And so do we have a responsibility to call out sin? I know what's the old saying that says the only way for evil to do what it's going to do is if good people or good men are silent. So somewhere along the line, we're going to have to take some stands. I'm not talking necessarily about being political or anything like that, but there's sometimes when we have to, I think, take some stands. The question I would have, are we using the teachings of Jesus to shape our view or our worldview of how we look at the things around us? That's who should be shaping us, not society, not culture, not our friends, not the politicians, not even our teachers probably, but certainly Jesus should be shaping our worldview of how we look at the world around us. And then the next scene is Rama and Mary are there on Thomas and Matthew, and all of a sudden a demon or a man possessed as a demon comes into the camp. Simon's already confronted him in one of the other episodes, but now he comes into camp, and all of a sudden John comes on the scene. Simon comes on the scene, and remember he gets in a wrestling match with the demon-possessed guy, and Jesus runs in, and as he runs in, he says, "Get out of him." And so he casts the demon out of the man. Okay, so that's another something that is the license of the writers of it. However, what might surprise me not is that Jesus cast out 11 demons in the New Testament. None in the Gospel of John, but in Matthew and Mark and Luke, he casts out demons 11 times. And of the 11 times, 5 of those times he spoke them out. He just cast them out. For instance, let me open your Bibles, if you would, to Luke chapter 4. Luke chapter 4. And so I think what he's doing is what the writers are doing is they're showing an example of when Jesus cast out a demon, okay? But in Luke chapter 4, beginning in verse 31, it said that, and he, that's Jesus, came down to Capernaum, a city of Galilee, and he was teaching them on the Sabbath, and they were amazed at his teaching, for his message was with authority. In the synagogue, there was a man possessed by the spirit of an unclean demon, and he cried out with a loud voice, "Let us alone. What business do we have with each other, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are. You're the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be quiet and come out of him." And when the demon had thrown him down in the midst of the people, he came out of him without doing any harm. So that's an example. There's other examples of Jesus casting out demons out of a person or persons. I have a list of them here, but that might just take up a lot of time if I were to try to go through each one of these. Any questions about that? Lots of debate about what demons are. You know, I think at one time someone says, "Well, I wish you'd do a sermon on demons." And I thought, man, how do you do a sermon on a demon on Sunday morning? Maybe that's more for like a class on demons. But any questions about that or any thoughts about it? The point of this episode is that Jesus has the power to cast out demons, okay? And that sets up an interaction with he and Simon. Don't know if that happened or not, but somewhere along the line, Simon's going to have an interaction with Jesus. So we don't know how Simon became a part of the apostolic band. We simply know that he did, but that's who he is. So in this episode, after he's cast out the demons, he says, "Take care of this, take care of that," and then Jesus takes Simon and they take a walk, and they walk down along beside what looks like a little pond or a little lake of some kind, and he's talking to them, and he asks Jesus, "Are you the Messiah?" And Jesus says, "I am the Messiah." And at that point, it shows Simon go to his knee, and he pledges his devotion and his commitment to Jesus and his mission. Now, I'll get to this in a little bit here. So he promises that to him, and then Simon stands up, and he asks Simon, he says, he goes, "Let me see your dagger." And so he pulls out this beautiful dagger, and he's holding it up, and there's a picture of him holding the dagger like this, and he hands it over to Jesus, and Jesus gets the dagger. Remember what Jesus does when he gets the dagger? He goes, "That's something. That's really something." And he's holding this beautiful dagger, and then he does this. Flips it out into the water. Do you remember what he said? "I didn't see that coming." And that's where the title of the episode comes from. You not what you expected. You know, Jesus does a lot of things that is not expected, but he says, "You didn't see that one coming." And you know that Simon had to go, "I didn't see that one coming." You know. And I think that's really true when you talk about when Simon decided to commit to them. So what would cause Simon to leave the mission of overthrowing Roman oppression and to follow Jesus? What would cause him to do that? Because he knows he's the Messiah. That's one. What else? By the way, what did most of the disciples and the apostles, what did they almost all think about Jesus being the Messiah? What did they think the Messiah was going to do? Yeah, they thought that he would eventually draw an army together and that he would lead a revolt and that he would push the Romans out. They have a very narrow vision. Their worldview is just of the Palestine area. They don't have a worldview. They have a very narrow view, but their narrow view is that the Messiah would come and restore the beauty of what the kingdom was like during David and Solomon's time and even beyond that. But he wasn't about that. And no doubt Simon, being a zealot, may have thought that exact same thing, but Jesus is going to teach him about a different kind of mission altogether. So Jesus had or offered a higher and more important mission to all those guys. More important than being a tax gatherer, more important than being a fisherman, more important than being a mason, more important than selling wine, more important than even being a zealot. So all the apostles discovered that Jesus was the Messiah. They all had a mindset, and they were all wrong. But they would learn that Jesus, as the Messiah, his mission was about overthrowing sin's oppression and not Roman oppression. And there is a huge difference. And that mission has not changed. That's the same mission that we have even today. So, imagine the change. If Simon was zealous to overcome the Roman oppression, think what kind of man he would be serving Jesus, a man zealous to carry out the mission of God, helping people overthrow the oppression of sin. That's huge when you think about that. Think about him being a zealot to overthrow Rome, and now he becomes a zealot for Jesus to help him overthrow sin in people's life. One would be taking life, the other would be giving life. What an incredible mission that is. And so can you think of a time that you chose Jesus over a job, over a friend, over a strong desire because of what his mission was about? So that's the episode. The episode, I think, is the choosing of Simon, but in particular, choosing that kind of a man. You probably have noticed how each of those men that he has chosen so far are so different from one another. Just like we are. There's no one in here, no one person that is exactly alike. I mean, we're so different and come from so many different walks and different stations, and yet here we are together. And I think one of the best ways to explain that, or to how that fits so beautifully together, is that if I were to ask you how many of you, well, let's do it. How many of you have great voices in here? Raise your hand. All you great voices, raise your hand. Why don't you guys raise your hand? Are you humble? Okay, so I could name you people in our congregation who have great voices, okay? And even they would be too humble to say, I've got a great voice. But here's what I do know, is that all you people out there who have these terrible voices, we sound really good when they're all blended together. When we're all in harmony and we are singing together, it's like there's a chorus that's been trained. We were at Caiaphas's house, down in a cistern where they would keep a prisoner, possibly where Jesus was placed. So we're down in this cistern, and there's 40 of us, and we're down inside this cistern below Caiaphas's house, and we're singing. Man, it was incredible. I mean, it was incredible. We had groups above us that were looking in, and when we walked out, they said, "Are you guys a singing group?" We're not a singing group, I can tell you that. Well, I guess we were a singing group, but we weren't a chorus that was running around performing. We were just down there and sang a couple of songs from memory, and it was beautiful. That's what I think Jesus did. He's brought together these people from so many walks of life, and he's made it beautiful. And he's given us this beautiful message and mission to help people who are oppressed with sin to see the light and to see the Savior. What a great mission it is, and Simon is an example of that kind of a change. So, do we have a song of invitation? Okay, so we're going to sing a song of invitation. If you would stand, if you would like to come forward and ask for prayers or whatever might be on your heart, then do so at this time.